Good afternoon, and on behalf of the National Park Service, welcome once again virtually to Fort Necessity National Battlefield. My name is Josh Freeman, Park Ranger here, and today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the defenses of Fort Necessity. One of the most common questions we get here from visitors at Fort Necessity when they first view the fort, they say, is that the fort? Is it really that small? Or they want to know the scale. We'll get a lot of questions, what's the scale of the fort compared to the actual size that it was historically? And that's oftentimes because visitors are confused about exactly what Fort Necessity is, its location, where it was, and what the components of its defenses were. Very often visitors are looking at the wooden stockade portion of the fort that you see behind me, and they view that as the entirety of Fort Necessity. And that's simply not the case, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And they also sort of have this misconception about fortifications in general. So very often when people hear or see, they see, on a sign or see it written Fort Necessity, they tend to think that they're going to find some large-scale, formal, European-style fortification here. They may have visited other fortifications, from the French and Indian War period, maybe at a place like Fort Ticonderoga, or maybe at Fort Niagara, two fortifications in New York from this period, perhaps. And we get a lot of visitors who have been to our friends and neighbors just to the north of us at Fort Ligonier, where they see a fairly large-scale, formal European-style fortification, a very well done, full-scale reconstruction. And so they're a little bit confused about exactly what a fort is and what they're going to see here at Fort Necessity. They expect to see that large-scale fortification, and that's not really what is here, obviously, and that's not what was intended to be here. So we're going to talk a little bit about military engineering in the 18th century, sort of how that translated to North America and to the wilderness conditions, and then what exactly George Washington built here at the Great Meadows in 1754. Those large-scale, formal European-style fortifications that we see came out of a system of development of military engineering and fortification, of siege works and large-scale fortifications that was developed through the last half of the 17th century and throughout the early periods of the 18th century. One of the main people that developed that system of engineering was Marshal Vauban. Vauban was Marshal of France under King Louis XIV, and Vauban really perfected the system of defense that was established throughout Europe. Many of the other engineers in Europe copied him. There were a couple other engineers who were very important, a Dutch engineer by the name of Cohorn, but he really developed this formal system of attack and defense that all the European powers copied and used as a main system to build their large-scale fortifications, to protect their cities, and what would be sort of supply points and magazines for operating field armies. So if you went throughout Europe in the late 17th and early 18th century, you would see these large-scale fortifications. And to a certain extent, that came to North America with the European powers as well. In some, in very important places, in harbors and ports, at a place like Louisburg, they would build these large-scale fortifications. But as you got into the wilderness, it became very, very difficult and expensive to not only build, but to maintain those types of fortifications. And so as you got farther away from the coast and into the wilderness areas, the fortifications tended to get smaller and smaller. That's because the difficulty of supplying them necessitated keeping a small amount of troops or garrison in those places. You could only, the amount of men you could feed was the only amount of men you could keep there to protect the place. And so therefore the forts were on the scale of the size of the garrison. So forts were built to size. If you only had 100 men that you could keep there for a long period of time, then you couldn't build this massive fortification because it would be very difficult to feed and maintain, and the small amount of soldiers would not be able to protect the entire fortification. So it's important to remember that these forts are sort of built to scale. And there are also different kinds of fortifications. Those large-scale, what we sort of call brick and mortar, stone or even wooden fortifications on the European model were not the only type of fortification. Field fortifications were also a component of 18th century military engineering. And field fortifications would be considered sort of the siege works that were designed to capture those fortifications, the long lines of walls and trenches and batteries that were built to capture those forts. And in field fortifications, we would sort of think of them as trenches, as kind of the best description from a modern perspective. If we think about the World War I trenches that we see across the Western Front during the First World War, those are really field fortifications. And so there would be lines of trenches and batteries, and there would also be these things called redoubts. And a redoubt was basically a wall built and to protect a certain strategic point along the line. It could be a place that they wanted to keep a small little amount of men, a garrison, or it was protecting a piece of what we would call key terrain, so a little hill, something that sort of commanded the surrounding area. And so key terrain was vital to maintain, and so a small little fortification called a redoubt would be placed on that key terrain. And so when we think about fort necessity, we need to think about fort necessity as field fortifications, because that's what Washington constructs here. And also we need to think of it in terms of redoubts. There are two phases of construction to the defenses here at Fort Necessity. The first or original phase you see behind me in the form of the wooden stockade wall. That's again the part of the fort that most people think of when they think of Fort Necessity. Our visitors come here, we'll bring them down here on a battlefield walk, or when we bring our school groups down, we'll walk them down the trail across the battlefield to the fort, and we'll actually bring them inside these grassy mounds that I'm standing next to that you see extending on my left and right. And before we get to the wooden stockade portion, I like to ask them, are you inside Fort Necessity? And invariably they'll say no. They tend to think of the wooden stockade as the fort portion of Fort Necessity. And that's not true. They are actually inside the defenses of Fort Necessity as soon as they come through this little opening here right in front of me. The wooden stockade that you see, I mentioned, is the earliest portion of construction. That's built by George Washington in late May of 1754. It's also important to remember why Washington built fortifications in the first place. What really was his mission as he was moving into the Ohio Valley in the spring of 1754? Washington's main objective is really to no point fight a battle. Britain and France are not at war in the spring of 1754 when Washington launches this campaign in early April. His main objective is to build a road, and then also to support a fort building operation already ongoing at the forks of the Ohio. Virginia, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie had sent a small force into the Ohio Valley in the spring of 1754 under Captain William Trent, and their objective is to build a fortification at the forks of the Ohio, to seize that key terrain where the site of modern-day Pittsburgh stands for the British. And they had already moved west and began the fort building operation. Washington's objective is to build a road to connect the westernmost Virginia settlements with that fortification to facilitate resupply and reinforcement. He's building a road. That's his main objective. He brings tools, obviously, along with him to do that. He brings blacksmiths along with him to make new tools, to fix old ones. So he's prepared to do that, and he's prepared to assist with fort building operations at the forks of the Ohio. However, something's going to happen that's going to sort of change the entire aspect of the campaign. One, in mid-April, the French will arrive at the forks of the Ohio and evict the British soldiers there who are sort of building the fort. There's no shots fired, but they do evict them at gunpoint. And the next thing that's going to happen is at the end of May. Washington arrives here at the Great Meadows on May 24th, 1754, and just several days later, on May 27th, Washington is going to decide to do something that's going to completely change the aspect of this campaign and really change world history. And that is on the night of May 27th, Washington will leave this spot, the Great Meadows, travel about 7 miles away to Jumonville Glen, where an engagement will take place with the French. I'm not going to go into great detail about the Jumonville incident, but suffice it to say that incident, that moment right there, will change the history really of the world, especially here in North America, and will obviously drastically alter what happens in this campaign. Having engaged with the French, Washington now knows that the French are probably going to respond, and he is going to hang out here at the Great Meadows for at least a couple weeks to try to see what the French response is going to be. Not only is he going to wait and see what the French response is, he's going to await reinforcement and resupply that have been continually promised him by his superiors, Governor Dinwiddie back in Virginia. So he's going to be here for a few weeks. And since he's going to be here for a few weeks, he decides he needs to have a place to put his supplies to keep them out of the elements. And so the initial construction here, starting on May 29th, 1754, is what you see behind me over my left shoulder. The cabin with a circular stockade fence around it. Now that cabin, that is basically for Washington supplies. No soldiers live in there. That's not Washington's headquarters. He has all these things, foodstuffs, flour and cornmeal. He has ammunition and gunpowder. He has other things like rum and wine. All those things he wants to put in a place to keep them out of the elements. He puts a roof over it, and then he puts a fence around it. The fence is twofold. It's a rudimentary defense. Washington has about 150 men at this point in the campaign. A round circular stockade, what we would also call a circular redoubt, is sufficient for those 150 men. We also have to keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, these are built to scale, and it only can build really, what he has the resources to build as far as the men and material. And so Washington builds a small little circular stockade fence for rudimentary defense. He writes to his younger brother Jack on May 31st that they had just completed a small palisado with which he did not fear the attack of 500 men. That last part he wrote to Governor Dinwiddie on June 3rd. The fort is finished. I'm not ready, I'm now ready to defend myself if I'm attacked. The fence is also twofold in that it protects Washington's supplies. Again, he's got gunpowder and rum. He also has 18-year-old soldiers. Those three things don't go together well in any century, including the 18th. And so Washington builds this fence to keep his men out of his supplies. We always ask that question here, who's he trying to keep out? We get the French, we get their American Indian allies, we get animals. Washington is yes, he's defending his men should they be attacked, but the rest of the time he's actually just trying to keep them out as well. So that's the initial phase of construction here, and again, this happens at the end of May. So the stockade and the cabin are completed really between May 29th and June 3rd. Washington hangs out here for a couple weeks awaiting the French response, but by the middle of June, the French don't come. However, he has received a little bit of resupply in the form of foodstuffs and flour and cattle, and he's also received reinforcement. So the rest of the Virginia Regiment brings his regimental strength up to about 300 men. They arrive here, and then also a 100-man independent company of British regulars. His Majesty's Independent Company from South Carolina under Captain James Mackay arrived on June 14th. With that reinforcement and with no response from the French, Washington feels he's able to move to the west, continue his mission, move over Chestnut Ridge, and continue the road building operation. He's going to try to reach a place called Redstone, what we know today as modern-day Brownsville, Pennsylvania. However, by the end of June, Washington finally receives intelligence that the French are in fact going to come after him. He knows the French have been reinforced. He's told there's well over 1,000 men that are going to come after him, French and their American Indian allies. And so at the end of June, Washington decides to retreat. His mission is up. He's not received reinforcement or resupply to any great extent. He's heavily outnumbered. So he's going to basically go back to Virginia. And a council of war with Washington's officers on June 29th unanimously recommends to retreat to the Great Meadows initially, possibly to retreat all the way back to Virginia. Washington Army retreats on June 29th and would arrive back here at the Great Meadows on July 1st, 1754. And at that point, the young commander, this 22-year-old officer, has a decision to make. Washington's men at this point are exhausted. They've been doing manual labor in the woods for several months now. Many of them are ill-clothed. They don't really have uniform items. They're still wearing their civilian clothing from home. They're malnourished. They haven't received enough daily nutrients to do all the manual labor they're doing. They've been on reduced rations for the last several days. So these men are exhausted. And as he sort of takes stock of the situation here at the Great Meadows on July 1st, Washington has to consider all his resources. So the resources are not just the men themselves and material, the food and ammunition that he has. The resources are also, the men's makeup themselves. Do they have enough stamina to, do any large-scale construction? Are they been nourished well enough to be able to, for their bodies to actually do the manual labor that's going to be asked of them? What is their psychological makeup at this point? Having been doing all this really hard work, not getting enough food, now they know that the French and their Indian allies are after them, the fear of the unknown and the fear of attack. So he has to take all those things into consideration. And then a commander's most precious resource, and something Washington has precious little of, is time. How much time does he have to actually build something here in the Great Meadows? He also has to take stock of how military defenses are constructed in the 18th century. So much like a modern military principle today, anytime you build a defensive position, you want clear fields of fire around it. You want enough room to be able to kill the enemy before they can get to you. And so what point out here in the wilderness does Washington have clear fields of fire? And so that really limits his ability to make a decision about where he's going to put his fortification. Clear fields of fire, there's only one spot, and that's right here in the middle of the Great Meadows. It's hard for us to imagine today when we come here to visit that when we drive by on US Route 40, we see many yards and lots of open cleared fields and farm pasture. That was not the case in the 18th century. So we like to think of the Great Meadows as sort of an oasis of grass in a desert of trees. Everywhere around here is trees, and not sort of the small trees that we see today. The trees that were here are large. They are old growth virgin timber, trees that have been here for hundreds of years and have never been cut. And so it's not very easy to cut them down. If you had modern engineering equipment or if you had chainsaws, people will always ask us, why didn't Washington put his fortification up on the hill that today hosts the Mount Washington Tavern? Well, it's covered in giant trees. And so if you have a very limited amount of time and you have exhausted soldiers and those soldiers have hand tools, what construction are you going to establish? Washington chooses to incorporate his defenses right here in the middle of the meadow. He's going to use the circular stockade that he had already built that was for 140 men and build a much larger redoubt, this one that needs to house 400 soldiers. In the 18th century, military engineering manuals told you exactly how much room you needed for how many men you had. British soldiers fought in 2 ranks in defensive fortifications. Each one of those soldiers needed 2 feet to be able to stand, to load and fire, maneuver his musket. And so if you had 400 men and they each need 2 feet, they're standing one behind the other, so you really only need 200 men of frontage. That's about 400 feet of defenses. If you actually walk out and measure the earthworks that are constructed here at Fort Necessity, they're almost exactly 400 feet. So Washington on July 1st makes the decision. Stand and fight, build a hasty defensive position here in the middle of the meadow, incorporating the circular stockade that's already here. And that's where we get the earthworks. So you can see the signs here, please stay off the earthworks. We'll often get questions from visitors, what is an earthwork? Well, the earthwork is what Washington decides to construct this large semi-rectangular redoubt that will actually be the main defensive position for the soldiers fighting here during the battle. On July 1st, Major Adam Stephen later recalled in his account of the battle that on July 1st we went into the woods, found some of the smaller trees that we could cut down, and started to bring them in to establish a breastwork. So we actually don't know were constructed. There's no contemporary account specifically how they were constructed. Major Stephen's account there is the closest we have. He says they brought in logs to erect a breastwork and enlarge the fort. Archaeology here, the evidence that we've seen, mostly from J.C. Harrington's 1953 archaeological work here, has found not really that many logs left. It was, in his account, mostly an earthen fortification. So most likely what happened is the men basically dug trenches, piled up the earth, and used logs here and there in the parapet or on the wall. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Who designed these fortifications? Who laid them out? Who was in charge? Well, we don't really know that either. George Washington, although he's a young, naive, inexperienced 22-year-old commander, was familiar with fortification and definitely familiar with measuring and laying out things. Let's not forget Washington's first job in life is a surveyor, so using a compass, using a theodolite, being able to measure and lay out things, that's second nature to him. And he's also familiar with fortifications, and then at least he's seen extensive fortifications. In 1751, young George travels with his older half-brother Lawrence to Barbados. Barbados in the 18th century, one of the most heavily fortified places in the world, especially in North America. And he would have seen extensive formal European-style fortifications there. Washington was most likely familiar, we don't know this for sure, but he was most likely familiar with Humphrey Bland's A Treatise of Military Discipline. That book is what's known as the Bible of the British Army in the 18th century, and it has several chapters on how to lay out field fortifications. Captain James Mackay is also here. Mackay, a regular British Army officer, a 20-year veteran, having served on numerous campaigns, having served in formal European-style fortifications in South Carolina and Georgia, would have been familiar with these. How would they have been laid out? Most likely what would have happened was an officer would have basically laid out a line, laid out the angles of the earthworks. What Washington decides to build here, to build this rectangular redoubt, is what we call 2 flèches, or arrowhead-shaped angles. So we see one large arrowhead-shaped wall on this side. There's another one over here that kind of matches that arrowhead-shaped wall. An officer would have laid out the line, basically measured out the angle, laid out the line, and then the men most likely began digging. They would have dug an interior trench on this side, the interior of the parapet or wall, most likely about 2 feet deep. That's what J.C. Harrington discovered in his archaeology, and it would have been about 2 feet deep as well because the Great Meadows being an open grassy area, it was an open grassy area because it is a very wet, sort of marshy place. About 2 feet down, they would have hit the water table. And so 2 feet is about the extent of these trenches. They would have dug down 2 feet, piled up the earth in the middle. They would have then went on the exterior of the line, dug another trench. Harrington thought that it was probably about at least as deep as the interior one, piled up the earth in the middle, and then logs would have been used at places throughout to sort of fortify the construction and to keep the earth in place. J.C. Harrington, in his 1953 archaeology, did find a large log laying on the interior of the fort, the interior trench of the parapet, that he believed was used in the construction of the earthworks. So that's how the earthworks would have been laid out. Again, they would have been much more substantial than what you see today. Harrington believed that the earth in the middle was piled up almost to probably about the height of 4 feet. Again, Major Stephen describes a breastwork, breast high, or on most of these soldiers in the 18th century would have been about 4 feet high. So you would have a 4 foot high earthen and log wall here in the center with a 2 foot ditch dug on the interior for the men to stand in. So the men, for the most part, would have had nearly about 6 feet of cover to stand behind when they were fighting from this wall. So much more substantial than what you see today. And it's easy to understand why our visitors, when they come here, they just sort of see these grassy mounds. These grassy mounds are just designed to sort of give you the layout, or where exactly the earthwork walls would have been. They're not designed to scale to sort of match what was here in the 18th century. And so that's confusing for our visitors when they come here. I would encourage the visitors when they come to take a look inside the lobby of our visitor center, where we have a diorama of the Battle of Fort Necessity and the fort itself. In that diorama, you can sort of see the wall built to scale, exactly what it would have looked like had you been here at the time of the battle. So again, much more substantial fortifications were built here to house Washington's men. As we know, the battle did not go that well for George Washington and his men. Throughout an all-day fight on July 3rd, the French would arrive here about 11 a.m. They would quickly surround this fort. The French commander here, Captain de Villiers, is a several decade-long veteran of wilderness combat, and his men would be successful on that day. However, Captain de Villiers, again, this veteran wilderness fighter, wrote admirably of Washington's fort. So in his report of the battle, afterwards, Captain de Villiers said that the fort was advantageously enough situated, and that he really couldn't send his men out into the open to sort of rush the redoubt without putting his, he calls it, His Majesty's, the lives of His Majesty's subjects expended in vain. So the fort was pretty well situated. Well, you gotta, I think, give a lot of credit to a 22-year-old George Washington for what he does here. Washington had labored under immense pressure and constraints throughout the campaign. He has limited supplies, really a limited amount of men. He's not getting real clear guidance from his higher headquarters, from Governor Dinwiddie back in Virginia. It takes a really long time for word to get back and forth. He's got a lot of stuff he's operating out of, and not the least of which is his limited resources: men, supplies, time. Washington really makes the only decision here when he decides he has to stand and fight, that he can no longer retreat. The French and Indians are going to catch him. He has to stand and fight. He makes the only decision available to him. There's not really a lot of options of where he's going to put the fort. It's going to be right here in this location, in the open. He's going to do what he can to clear fields of fire around with the time and the resources that he has. What he builds is actually pretty good. So I think we do a disservice to George Washington and the men who fought here when we sort of look at it as, this is some young, dumb, naive kid that didn't know what he was doing. So we'll have a question and answer period coming up here. If you have any questions specifically about the earthworks, the fortifications here, or the battle, thank you for being with us here today at Fort Necessity. Goodbye.